It's a real pleasure to be in this room, the room that Ives called his study, built in the early 1920s at his home in West Reading, Connecticut. And here at the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the room is bodily carried and reinstalled so that everything in this room, all the books are in its place. And we're in a sacred center of Ives's late creative life. In here, he worked on the later editing of his music, on some of his last compositions, played every day at the keyboard, started every morning with Bach before breakfast. And every one of his books is in place as it was in the time. And you see all the features of his life, his felt hat, his father's cornet, the piano that meant so much to his compositional method, and the doors into the room right by the piano, which went from the dining room into this study, are loaded with memorabilia of his life, such that it's a metaphor for his mind and his music. This is a place that I first visited in 1972, and many times afterwards, and at the request of the family, cleaned the shelves and the books several times over the decades. Then finally in 2012, the need to sell the house meant that we had to pack up everything in it, and I did all the books in order so they could be reinstalled here. So it's always an amazing experience to come back in this room and really feel Ives's presence, I think, in this room. It's all of his artifacts, all of his life and his family pictures, etc. But there's still music ringing in the air. And in fact, the piano is a beautiful instrument as an upright and can make music, as is part of the Accessive series you can hear on our Ives website. So enjoy, like the Alcotts being played by Don Berman. Let me talk about how I came to Ives. I think each of us has a story about the first thing that grabbed them. And for me, it came through the great Leonard Bernstein talking about Ives. Actually, he was talking about American music. This would have been the spring of '64, perhaps, and a young people's concert on the tube, and I'm watching. Nice music till we got to this Ives thing. I didn't know anything about Ives. So, okay, they're introducing the 4th of July, one of the movements of the holidays by Ives. And I listened to that, and I was completely taken, smitten, swept away, goosebumps, some kind of reality landing on me that I just didn't know existed, and I went mad for Ives' music immediately. I found Hanson's recording, Three Places in New England. On the other side was the Third Symphony. I also found Bernstein's own recording of the Second Symphony. Those pieces were not alike, and they weren't like the 4th of July that I had just been shocked by in such a positive way. Old Putnam's Camp of Three Places has its close similarity in spirit. That just told me that there was a wider frame, a wider horizon, a panoply of music that I needed to dig into. And I just kept purchasing another sheet music and another songbook and another orchestra score until I was really becoming deeply inside Charles Ives. In that collection of first things that I fell in love with was the Putnam's Camp movement of Three Places in New England. That particularly interested me, the spirit of it, perhaps. And I lived in Washington, D.C. I was able to go down to the Library of Congress and see the Kirkpatrick catalogue of Ives's music. There, I saw that there were several pieces that had gone into the Putnam's Camp movement. Country Band March and a 1776 Overture and March. I was particularly fascinated by Country Band March. And I took that piece in my mind and in my heart into Indiana University and being a student there. And while I was there, I started toying with that piece, which was missing a page, being possibly completable by turning to the earlier versions of Three Places in New England's Putnam's Camp. And I ventured in my graduate degree, in a master's degree, to make the realization of Country Band March a reality. And that was at Hawaii. Very nice place to work on Charles Ives. I recommend going to Hawaii. There, I finished that and I sent it to John Kirkpatrick, the curator of the Ives Papers in New Haven, Connecticut, at Yale University. Got no feedback, nothing. Went through the summer, nothing happening. I finally called John Kirkpatrick at his home and said, "Have you looked at it?" And he said, "Oh, my dear, no, so many things, la da da, been away. Let me look at it right now." And that's the way you got John Kirkpatrick, stick his nose in front of something and he would dig in. He called me back and he said, "Come up here, I want to talk to you about this piece." This was August of '72. So I met with John Kirkpatrick. What was supposed to be 1 hour went all day. We weren't done. I had to stay overnight. We spent the next morning still working on this 4-minute piece. I felt dissembled from all of the careful criticism of what I had done. But John, as it turned out, was thrilled by what I had done and said, "Let's have lunch." And at lunch he said, "Couldn't you just stay here? I need you." It's 1972. In a year and a half, it would be the Ives centenary year. And as I look back, John was worried that his interest in the chamber music, the songs, and the keyboard literature wasn't going to cover all of the orchestral stuff, which he could see I was into. And so I was drawn into a world I thought would have had no way of entering. I was suddenly in this apprenticeship to John Kirkpatrick, this great pianist who had premiered the Concord Sonata back in 1938-9 and championed Ives' music and cataloged Ives' music. So there I was, drawn in. And the Country Band March was my entry point. The next thing that John Kirkpatrick asked me to do was the orchestration of Three Places in New England. There had been an early version for full orchestra, but it was all cut up and scuttled and broken by the process in 1929, a good 15 and 16 years after the piece had been written, to fashion it for a small orchestra instead of a large orchestra so that Nick Salimsky could conduct it with his Boston Chamber Orchestra, do the premiere. I did a lot of recomposition to make the small orchestra feel heavier, denser. He added dissonance and filled out chords and gave a lot of energy into the piano part. John wanted me to restore the original orchestration, and that was doable because we had all of the text of both that we could work with, and I was fairly expert at manipulating the sounds in the orchestra, and I understood what Ives was after, and I could see it on his pages. So I restored the original orchestration to the later text, and that is the way Three Places is by far the most frequently performed. So that was a project that got ready just in time for the centenary. During that time, right along parallel with working on Three Places New England, my friend Ken Singleton and I were both interested in Ives. We'd both arrived at the same moment in 1972 at Yale. And one day, John Kirkpatrick saw us both working on our separate small projects. I think I was working on 1776 Overture. that other piece that went into Putnam's camp. And John brought in what he called copy E of the 114 songbook. And he said, there's some interesting markings in here I want you to see in the songs. Ken and I took a look at that and saw that what Ives was doing was orchestrating these songs completely with his annotations that went no less far than what you needed to know how to completely orchestrate the song. So, wow, we just saw this fantastic group of literature. Mists, Swimmers, The Last Reader, a long evening, a long list of outstanding songs that could be realized in Ives' own intentions orchestration. So we dove into that and we piled those up. Pretty soon we had a serious pile of literature that needed to be heard. And the centenary was only, by that point, literally months away. And we decided that we were going to get a bunch of the Yale students and some of the faculty to do a read-through. And we did that. And everybody was stunned and said, boy, this needs to be performed. We said, okay, let's do it. So it was March of the centenary year, October being the actual centenary. And in that March concert, we premiered 14 works of Charles Ives, including Countryman March, 1776, some of those songs from the copy E, some early marches, and just had a fabulous success. Nice coincidence, Yale has contacts, and one of the graduates of the Yale School of Music was now head of CBS Records, Columbia Records, now these days Sony Records. And he sent a producer up to see what was all this stir going on in New Haven with all these premieres. A guy walked on the stage after our concert was over and said, CBS wants to record this concert. 2 weeks later, we recorded for CBS. And they had just the lead time they needed from March to October to turn a recording around, and that came out in October. What wheels this magic around Charles Ives has. Tremendous things opened up, one after another. It always seemed like Charlie was the hand that was pushing these things forward. So after that tremendous success, we needed to do the Ives Centenary in the fall. I spent the summer working up the ragtime dances and some other things, and in the fall we did another concert with a ton of premieres. And another big success as part of the actual Ives Centenary of New York and New Haven. A very big extended affair, including lots of concerts. We were the very last event. And that success led me to a lifetime of editing Charles Ives. It wasn't over. John Kirkpatrick found ways that I could work on Ives' music and be paid. A lot of this had been volunteered time up to this point. The Ives Society has seen to the complete works of Ives being edited. That will be all done in the Ives centenary year, sesquicentennial year, which from the point of this taping is just a year off. We've done all the orchestral works and the small orchestra works, the chamber music, the first piano sonata being worked on as I speak, the quartets done, all the songs, 187 files of songs and versions of the songs. The fragments have been engraved. The exercises that Ives did before and at Yale, all engraved for the first time. And all of this is likely, in part at least, of this will be on the Ives website to see, and then the publisher's preferred actual publications will be coming out in due order. It's been a huge project, very time-consuming. I work with passion and zealotry on this a full work day, 7 days a week for, well, it's been a 40-year career, 50-year career of working on Ives. In the last decade, it has largely been 7-hour days, 7 days a week. I think I go shopping on Sundays, and that cuts into that schedule a little bit. And it's so gratifying to be buried in the complete literature, to engrave every note. My engraving goes on to be edited further for beautification, shall we say, when it goes to publication. But hands-on, I'm entering this music, and it just is an extraordinarily gratifying experience. Feel every note, to consider every layer and every shadow line that happens in his music, and appreciate the incredible craft, care, vision that Charles Ives could put into every bit of his music, even the experiments. Absolutely remarkable that way. When working on editing Ives, one has to collect first all of the papers that might be relevant. You have to then deeply look at those to make sure that you understand the priority of them, the chronology of them. Some are obviously a sketch, fragmentary sometimes. Another thing, usually laid out for piano, will be a sketch. If we're talking about, say, a symphony, you'll have a sketch, you'll have a score sketch. Score sketch opens up more staves over a rewrite of the piano continuity of the work. And in those staves that are available above the left and right hand of the piano will be new lines that are adding layers or elucidating the specific line that's for labeled flute, violin, oboe. And you see Ives filling out his vision of the sound of the piece. Next, if one is so lucky, and certainly possible in the stream of things, you'll have a pencil score that is a complete realization of the piece, often covered with ideas about improvements. Then, if we're lucky, there'll be an ink score that really codifies and focuses how that work is supposed to be done. In many cases, Ives would then later engage a copyist to make that ink score into something even more elegant. Ives's own ink scores are really quite clear, has a reputation for being mysteries in Ives's music, and that's not valid. There are, amongst the piano studies, for instance, pieces that are a challenge but are not unclear. It's just that you have to work harder at reading a more energetic, more inspired, fast, sometimes writing. But if you've got all of those things and a copyist score, you still have a challenge, assuming you've very clearly figured out what the priority is when you, once you've looked at things, it's possible you look back at a sketch page and go, no, that's not an early sketch, that's really a patch. You figure out these things from siglia that might be on the page telling you, and you see internal memos and you begin to make connections. Once you've really understood those things, you write a description of sources that lays out what pages are there, what measures are on that page, what memos are on those, and transcribe them. You try to date, if it can be done, that stage of the work, all through those various stages. Really, only then can you start editing the piece, and let's say you've an orchestra piece, or even piano works can have a copyist score. You want to depend on that copyist score as the last word, but you can find that the copyist has made an error in copying from the ink score. Judgment calls about whether that's somehow dictated change by Ives. You have to use your best judgment, and who's better judge than the editor who's on top of all of this, and correct things that need to be corrected, or find things that were overlooked in the sketch the pencil version before the ink version might have slower and faster here that weren't in the thing. Provisionally, perhaps in parentheses, you'll include those in the later edition. And there's critical commentary that goes right through every measure, explaining where faster and slower came from an earlier version. Now here it's presented in parens because it's not in the copyist score, which is identified as the primary source. Hope I'm not burying you information, but it's a meticulous, slow, scholarly job to do even a piano piece, but then a quartet or a big choral piece or an orchestra piece takes yet more time to do. In the end, to the goal of the 150th anniversary of Ives's birth, which is 2024, it is a project that will wrap up and leave this great legacy of music in perfected, accessible editions. And especially when dealing with the orchestra versions, one has to consider performance considerations that improve the understanding in the orchestra. You sometimes have to write out the realization of something, decide on divises so that they're more playable for an orchestra. In the case of really complicated works in the Fourth Symphony and in the 4th of July, you have to get to the point that each stand of the violins has a different part in front of them so that they're not looking at clusters. They're only looking at a set of thirds, and someone else is looking at another set of thirds. And each stand adds up to what Ives wanted. And the old performing sets would give you 9 pitches stacked up and just throw it to the wind that the players were going to find what notes to be playing. Those are solved in the Ives Society's editions, the performance editions that are out there for orchestras. Ives didn't have this advantage of his music being played in his lifetime often enough or by decent large ensembles, so that it meant that copyist versions in his lifetime were often rather provisional and not ready for prime time, if I can borrow that phrase. And the big impact of Ives Society editions is that for large ensembles like orchestras, to have music that they can immediately engage with without raising 15 hands in the orchestra to say, I've got a question, don't give a downbeat yet, I don't understand what I'm doing, to a situation where the conductor can simply give a downbeat. The players are expecting their situation. The violist in the Fourth Symphony knows that they're at freedom to play their tempo until a signal point, etc. And this means that we concentrate now and in the future on the interpretation of the music rather than climbing over the challenges, the impediments that music performance materials until the 1980s or 90s on presented. And so Ives has never had a fair growth of legacy of performance. I'm afraid that we have to invent our performance style for Ives. We have only a few recordings. We have priceless ones of Charles Ives playing, but he plays in a style that's unlike the way he's written on the page. So it's like 2 different sources that you have to decide how to deal with. We have the Fourth Symphony being premiered in 1927, the second movement being played by Goossens and a pickup orchestra. And then in 1946, we have the Third Symphony being premiered. We have, in 1951, the Second Symphony being premiered. In 1954, the First Symphony. It's backwards. People are not learning Ives in a sequence of development. They're seeing Henry Cowell saw to this, that the public was going to hear about Charles Ives' music in the edgiest fashion first, him as a avant composer as a gnarly old man being presented to them. And yet Ives' music was written by a young, vital, athletic human being. So backwards, and the publications of these musics being rather ratty and provisional, hurried right after the premieres of the piece. The Second Symphony was premiered. It was a lovely ink score that came out and was published. It's full of wrong notes. And people assume, because Cowell had put the gnarly stuff up front, that those wrong notes were right notes. But they weren't. We corrected all of that. And now there's a lovely edition. A little backwards to develop an interpretive style for a great, great composer like this. To be doing it without Ives hovering and saying, yeah, that's what I meant. No, this is what I meant. And decent materials to read for the performers. So all a bit backwards. It adds up that a generation of people, starting with Bernstein in a sort of serious way, with John Kirkpatrick at the keyboard, with Bernstein doing orchestral stuff in the 1960s, we began to have a picture. But Bernstein didn't interact with Charles Ives. And there is one priceless thing, and I can't think of another letter that Ives wrote ever to any performer to say, thank you for doing something, here's what was wrong. He wrote to Bernstein after the Second Symphony, and he said, lovely that you did this, but all the allegros were too slow. Bernstein got that memo and that letter, and in his subsequent performances, he was slower than he was at the premiere. In his second recording of the work, it was yet slower than his first recording of the work. So here's Bernstein ignoring the priceless advice from Charles Ives. We have to piece together the real way to do Ives. Donald Berman was a student of John Kirkpatrick, so he learned from John Kirkpatrick. He knows that John Kirkpatrick was, in a way, a classicist approach to Charles Ives, that you hear in Ives's recordings a much more fluid time, a much more romantically driven interpreter of his own music. And we've all absorbed, especially from being able to hear Ives plays Ives, a new way of presenting Ives that is closer to the reality of Ives in his time. I don't know if I can play the Second Symphony allegros as fast as Ives may have wanted them, but I've tried, and it's pretty exhilarating to use some of the tempos he actually has on his page that Bernstein was overlooking, and his direct feedback about that. When I switch from being an editor of Ives's music to being a performer of Ives's music, it's take off the hat and it's a whole new ballgame. I feel like I have to enjoy the music myself. I have to believe in what I'm doing. I have to interpret it in the way that I think Ives meant, even when he's not giving me enough instructions about what the real tempo should be. There's internal evidence, internal things that make you feel the music. But I think performers always have to do that. They have to do that with Beethoven. They have to do that with Brahms. They have to do it with all these greatest composers. And with Ives, I'll read all of those marginalias and I'll say, I think that pushing the tempo here is actually a good idea. He left that out of the final score, but I think that I'll try that. There's lots to learn from reading the critical commentary or the digested in the back of many of the orchestra scores, digested list of commentary that dig to all of these possibilities. And that can be very exciting. Everybody will make it their own. But through our Ives Society editing work, you have the opportunity to make informed choices. And that's one of the great joys. So sitting in this room, I'm hearing my own voice, and I wish it was Charlie Ives' own voice. He was such a generous spirit, such a humanist. His music speaks that, but also his life does. His generosity to other musicians, performers. he made the careers of a lot of people, and he never wanted credit, and he really buried the credit. We don't have any of the checkbooks to see the exact amounts, but for instance, he wins a Pulitzer Prize because Lou Harrison had premiered his Third Symphony back in 46, and he wins the Pulitzer Prize in 47. He immediately took half of that money and gave it to Lou Harrison, and the other half to other purposes. We know that he supported recordings, careers, publications, the music magazine, journal, or whatever you'd call New Music, which published for years under Cowell almost anybody else's music. And Ives never pushed himself in front of others, even much less composers. He nonetheless felt they were good people, they were struggling, and he gave his money to them. So performing careers, publishing careers, to this day, Ives's estate through the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the endowment that the Charles Ives Society has and the monies that the American Academy transfers to the Ives Society is supporting scholarship and the publications of Ives's music, performance and recordings of Ives's music. So Ives is still helping all of us forward. His principal intent in leaving the estate to the American Academy of Arts and Letters is realized through the support of young composers, college-age composers, post-college-age, start-of-career composers, that they get these substantial gifts for a year. And then the Charles Ives Living, which allows great amounts of funds to go for a 2-year period to a composer who might be, in Ives's eyes, trapped at a university, going to committee meetings and doing the mundane. There, they can take a 2-year hiatus, not at the cost to the university, not against their own sabbatical leave, but a 2-year break to really compose. And this is what Charles Ives did by having his business, that he didn't have to support himself through his own music. And this tremendous legacy is permanent and goes on forever, supporting these great causes. The more one lives with this music and his life, the more giant Ives appears. He just rises and rises. There's just no way to estimate how pure a soul, how great a person he was through all that he did for so many people, and how much he has left in his legacy, one, to entertain and fulfill us, but also through funding, keeping other composers able to do their careers. It's overwhelming. It makes me very emotional about Ives, and very continually dedicated to his legacy. He's one of the greatest giants in music. I think he's one of the greatest giants in humanity.